Perfect.
So our next speaker is Christina Delaila talking about GDPR.
Okay, so I'm just gonna try and look at the screen because my computer failed me. Just don't look. I'm very proud of its brand, so it's okay. So I'm Christina. Thank you very much for choosing to attend this presentation. I'm very excited to be the one that is gonna do the GDPR talk inside this room, and I'm gonna talk about a few things related to open source and the quest for GDPR compliance. Okay, a few words about me at XWiki. I am the DPO of XWiki SIS, which is a top sponsoring company of XWiki, the open source project, which means basically that it has, according to its rules of governance, the most numerous number of developers inside the XWiki dev core team. Regarding CryptPad, this is the result of work of our research team, and it's also an open source project. And it consists of encrypted editors which are stored inside the cloud. And it's, in terms of the GDPR, it's encryption by design. And our privacy compliance journey is something related to the communities formed around these two projects. And this talk is going to be about how the GDPR impacted the open source communities, and second of all, how the open source communities can impact the GDPR and the principles of the GDPR, because the open source communities have principles and also have very healthy practices that can help and enhance the principles that the GDPR is talking about. Now let's see what the GDPR did to us. It has a lot of transversal impacts, and it was, to be honest, it was very challenging for me to do a slide about like an overall thing of how GDPR compliance might work, and I just split it in like three main areas. Now, one impact was from the point of view of the legal and compliance governance. Basically, all companies, all businesses, all organizations had to review their privacy strategies, taking into consideration the fact that there is a major risk of non-compliance. So basically, when a company is doing budgeting, it should take into consideration the fact that maybe there is a high risk of non-compliance. So the budget should take into consideration also these aspects. Regarding accountability, it changed basically the burden of proof, because so far, if somebody were to say something, the company was the one who was going to say, oh, I'm innocent. But now the company should be proactive and should prove its compliance with the GDPR. And this means like a set of a lot of things that a business should do. Regarding lawfulness, this is the part about the consent of the person, and the consent needs to respect a few rules that the GDPR imposes. About policy making, this was like reviewing all the policies that we have, respecting a few standards, respecting a few guidelines from the GDPR, and also a lot of auditing. So basically, auditing is our weapon. We audit something, and then we propose measures, and then we improve things inside the organization. So organizations had to think a lot, starting with 25th of May last year. From the point of view of the technical aspect, what the GDPR does is enhances a lot of things to do regarding handling data breaches. And also, it proposes encryption solutions to be a best practice inside the organization. So basically, encryption became like the rule that we need to take into consideration. We need to think about anonymizing data. We need to think about encrypting data. We need to think about this choice as primary between the choice of encrypting and not encrypting. We should go on the part of encryption. And also privacy by design and by default, and it made a lot of difference also from the point of view of data collection and lifecycle, because now the data should take into consideration, now the data should be collected also for specific purposes and should be kept also as long as those purposes exist, and also it should not be extended. It should not be used more than it should be, and so on. I'm sure that you received you are very informed from this point of view about what these things mean. These are a few of the areas of the biggest fines that were applied so far. and a lot of them take into consideration things that have happened before the GDPR got enforced. And we can see that one of the main things is related to consent, and this is like what the marketing team inside an organization did. And when the consent was, for example, not freely given, or when the consent was like, instead of yes and no, the options was yes or yes, or something like that. Or when, I don't know, sending an email to the data subject and adding in CC all the other people from our mailing list. I mean, these are things that basically have happened and have, on the other side, have brought a lot of fines to the people doing them because they did not consider the lawful way of treating consent. Regarding data security areas, there have been a lot of leaks, breaches. The InfoSec area has been around the block for a long time, so it's not something really new for them. And regarding those two things that I placed there, you can see there some causes of why breaches happen, and also you can see some effects of what happens when a breach is happening. Basically, if we are talking about a small business, pretty much 60% of small businesses close their doors before the GDPR. This is actually a statistic that happened in 2014. Now let's see what the GDPR did very fundamental. It was impacted from the point of view of the relationship between the data controller and the data processor. Basically, a data controller is the one that is the company that determines the purpose and means of processes. And the processor is the one that is having a DPA with the controller, and is the third party that processes it on the controller's behalf. And in between themselves, we have currently this thing called DPA, Data Processing Agreement, and they are obliged basically to establish a few set of rules in between of them, taking into consideration different aspects regarding how they will handle data breaches. If, for example, a data processor has a data breach, it should inform the data controller. There are like lots of things that the GDPR imposes that pretty much previously were not very enforced and were not very clear. So basically the GDPR did a very cool thing in determining what are the relationships between the controller and the processor, and also take into consideration also the fact that somebody can act as a controller and a processor on the same relationship, depending on the data that we are talking about. So you can be a controller and also a processor at the same time, basically, depending on the data that you are handling inside your organization. And also, the processor can have sub-processors, and the relationship pretty much stays the same. And if you think that this distinction between controllers and processors is pretty much something new, in fact, it existed previously. And a very revolutionizing thing that happened around 2012 was when Google Inc. was sued. And at that point, there was a decision that was brought by the European Court of Justice on Google Spain and Google Incorporated versus Mr. Gonzalez, who was a Spanish citizen. So this decision at that point was very revolutionizing, because up to that point, Google was considering itself a data processor. And after this decision, because the European Court of Justice made this ruling, Google was considered a data controller, which meant basically a lot of extra work of them to do, and this was even before the GDPR. And the impact of this was that by 2016, Google received a lot of requests to remove approximately 1.2 million websites, which previously were not at their door, or which previously existed at their door, but they would have had the opportunity of just saying, I'm a processor, go to the controller. And now we pretty much know Google is a controller. So we do have the opportunity of making a lot of requests, for example, because it's our data. And they should answer to those requests, of course. Now let's see how we are imposing this model, the model between data processor and data controller, to the open source model, because it's a bit challenging. It's not really the classical business report that we are having when we have a company and another company. We have a lot of controllers and processors around the open source communities, around the open source ecosystems, and we have also the community itself. The community is not something that is for profit. It's something that is formed by us. It's formed by data subjects that are physical persons that pretty much have rights now, which are very enforced by the GDPR. And I call the others, the controllers and processors, the infrastructure providers. They are the ones who, let's say, they are buying our beer, but pretty much they are providing our hosting. If we have a forum or a website, for example, they are offering us a lot of things around what we are doing inside our open source community. And now let's give some examples of who's who. Who is a controller and who exactly is a processor? In XWiki, the open source software, the controller of hosting on xwiki.org, which is where you will find the open source project, is XWiki SIS, which is the company that offers services on top of the open source project. And on behalf of the company, OVH, which is another company, offers hosting. So basically, XWiki SIS is a controller of that data from xwiki.org, which is the open source project, outsource, let's say it like that, to a processor, which is OVH. And we have basically this report between these three aspects. We have the community, we have XWiki SIS, and we have also the OVH, which is the data processor. On GitHub, for example, that we all know very much, loves a lot the open source software. GitHub acts as a controller of our personal data from our free private user accounts. So if we have an account on GitHub, which I pretty much know you do, GitHub, the company, is the one that is the controller of your email address, for example. And if you are, for example, a business like XWiki SIS, for example, and you buy some things from them, some services, and you want them to process the invoices, they become the processor of those invoices. So they act also as a controller on some aspects and as a processor on some other aspects. Now, why should they process our personal data? Because the GDPR offers us a few very clear reasons of why somebody can process the personal data that we give them, that we offer them. First of all, it's compliance with the law, and this is basically a legal obligation. For example, invoices, we pretty much know now, depending on the legislation, there is a certain time that we need to keep those invoices. So basically, if somebody makes a request to delete an invoice from our database, we cannot do it because the law says we cannot. So we have to keep it. Now, the contract reasons. This is a contract that is done by the data subjects. For example, if you come to FOSDEM and you sign an agreement with the conference organizers, you pretty much have a contract with them that you should come, you should pay, you should be here, and so on and so forth. Legitimate interest is something very, very interesting because it's always something about assessment. It's about balancing. It's about balancing the interest of the person who is a data controller and the interest of the data subject itself. Because, for example, if you are a notorious person and there's an article in the newspaper about yourself, if you make a deletion request, maybe the newspaper can say no, but you're a public person. But if you're a private person, then the balance pretty much shifts. And the GDPR talks about careful assessment. And the consent, which should be specific, informed, it should require an affirmative action, and it should be freely revocable. Basically, if I change my mind, the data should be given back. Now let's see some illustrations. From the point of view of the contract, your username and email address are given in order to create your GitHub account. And also you are pretty much accepting their terms of service agreement with the GitHub. This is the example of the conference, the previous, that I previously explained. So we have the terms of service agreement with the company GitHub, and we accept it. So basically, we accept them to process our email address or our username. The consent is something related, for example, to my picture from xwiki.org, where it was something not necessary for that account to exist, but I just decided to offer them my picture. So they are processing my picture based on my consent. Legitimate interest, and this is interesting, the commits to the open source code of an open source project. In order to make that commit to the open source project, you need sometimes to provide your name, to provide your email. And you are pretty much aware of the fact that you are doing this, and your intention pretty much is to make it public, is to contribute. So that processing is legitimate on behalf of the open source people that you are, of the open source software that is processing your personal data. And for example, we have here the developer certificate of origin from Linux that pretty much states what the GDPR has said, and this is a bit like older, including all personal information I submit with it, including my sign-off. So when you contribute to the Linux open source project, you pretty much are aware of the fact that your email address will always be public, or that what you are committing will always be public and will not be deleted if you have a data subject request. Let's see, open source and the GDPR. The control of the downloaded, the control of the data is to the people. And this is what pretty much the open source did, the open source software did. As the GDPR has as main aim, as main spirit, to give the data back to the people. It doesn't belong to the controllers, it belongs to the data subjects. Cloud computing has been a very old debate around the open source software community, and with this model of processor and controller, what the GDPR did was something good for the open source, because it pretty much cleared the relationship between the cloud provider and the people using that provider. The provider is a processor, and the person using it is offering that data in order for it to process. So basically, it enhanced this report. It helped. It contributed to this debate on cloud computing. Regarding extraterritoriality, this is highly compatible with what the online environment has, because it's like perfect. If the GDPR pretty much becomes like the new standard of the future regarding privacy, and it extends borders. Even though it is in theory applicable to data subjects from the European Union, it pretty much in the future might become the standard. And pretty much people from outside Europe are considering the GDPR when they are doing their policies. The open source governance is by default transparent, and this is something that helps the GDPR, because we can see bugs, for example, and we can fix them. If there is a security issue, we can fix it. And everything is pretty much visible to everybody, and everybody can pretty much contribute to the success of the open source project. And also, this transparency contributes a lot to help us prevent vulnerabilities of a code, because people are participating, and also it's very privacy oriented because it's for the people, by the people, and also it's facilitating meritocracy, which pretty much speaks by itself. The open source innovation privacy is something that is not really a coincidence, in my opinion, because a lot of the open source projects nowadays are considering privacy as something very fundamental inside their principles, inside their projects. We have decentralization, we have federation networks, we have zero-knowledge collaborative software, which is CryptPad, and I wanted to illustrate to you how privacy by design and default are enhanced by zero-knowledge collaborative software. And by default, I mean, zero-knowledge collaborative software basically using encryption pretty much speaks by itself regarding privacy by design. And the privacy by default thing, which means that an organization should only process data that is necessary to an extent that is necessary as long as it is necessary. And this is something actually debatable, because if we store data in the cloud, should it be by default encrypted? This is more like something to debate, because on the other hand, the cloud provider will not be able to provide backups. And this is something that it should be balanced. Like what should be the perspective of the future regarding cloud computing? It should be private by default to have it encrypted, or it should be privacy by default to have the current status quo. Now, feel free to contact me. Thank you very much for attending this presentation again. And if you have any questions, please do ask. I think we have some time.
We have some time for questions.
Hello, thank you very much
Hello.
for the talk.
So
my question is around the kind of legitimate interest without somebody overseeing, like either a regulator or somebody that, legal department, etc. The temptation is to tip the legitimate interest ever in the favor of, the companies or the data processor or the sub-processors. Do you think that that's currently one of the problems with the regulation, or will we get to that as more information about GDPR emerges?
Okay, that's a good question. What I think is that it's something very healthy to debate first inside the organization if we should accept or not a data subject request, and it pretty much, this debate contributes to the future of that data request. Pretty much to show you how this thing is working. You as a data subject, you are sending to the organization a data subject request. And the organization currently should think first. Should it accept your request or should it not accept your request? And I believe this is actually healthy in determining what is the positioning of that organization, because pretty much what that organization is doing is not really ruling what is the right thing to do. That is the job of a judge that pretty much afterwards might come. And what the organization does is have an answer to that request. And after, if you, let's say, you're not satisfied with that request, you can move forward and you can go to the national authority and say why you are not satisfied with that request. And now we have another procedure where the national authority, who are not the judges, are the ones who are deciding if that request should be okay, if you're right or if you're wrong. And if you are not satisfied with that thing, you can go, as Mr. Gonzalez did, to a national court. He went to Spain first. He went to a national court from Spain. And afterwards, he was not satisfied with what the National Court of Spain did. And then he went even higher, and then even higher, it encountered a judge that had a question for the European Court of Justice. And the European Court of Justice, it had pretty much more questions, but one of the questions were, is Google incorporated a controller, or is it a processor? And the European Court of Justice said at that point, before the GDPR, that it is a controller. And this was an evolution towards the perspective of how we handle privacy. And I believe this is healthy, because in general, in my opinion, it's very important to debate, and I am very pro that attitude. Do you have any more questions?
Sorry to steal.
It's okay.
This way we start.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hi. Hello. Just a quick question. Is she there? Is she going? I don't know whether she will hear me. Hello. No. Hi, just a quick question.
Okay, yes.
Regarding, so I'm a teacher, I'm an educator, not a software developer.
Yes.
GDPR came into the UK for us as educators is quite a big thing, and across the world for us to look at to conform to schools.
Because in reality, I cannot really hear you. So.
Yeah. Oh, right. Can you hear me now?
Excuse me?
Can you hear me? No?
No.
No, she can't hear me from here. So
I can hear that you said she can't hear me.
Oh, right, okay.
Yep.
So, yeah, we had GDPR come in for schools to use that we had to take quite seriously. But things like, and I won't name names, but some of the software that's being given to schools for free now has like 35 million users in the UK. We're opting into them knowing that they conform to GDPR, but then we're not looking when it goes to the legitimacy interests that those companies then share to 45 other companies under the basis of the information they collect about children in schools to 45 other companies under the legislation of legitimate interests. You cannot, I have tried, you can't seem to see or get any further than that. They just stand there and go, it's legitimate interest that we take your kids' information from school and we farm it out to Google, to Amazon, to all of these other proprietary things. But educators aren't getting the message that the free software that they're getting sold at national conferences, like I spoke at BET, which billions of pounds were spent on to sell it to us, that this is an issue for their data privacy, for their students. We're effectively giving away young people's information, and not even parents or these kinds of things are getting through to them. GDPR, how do you feel that that has made a dent on it? Because I feel like it's just gone, yeah, we got legitimacy with GDPR, but now we can just put legitimate interests and everybody will be fine about it.
I don't think personally that legitimate interest is something that that is, let's say, just posted and it's like, yeah, it's in legitimate interest. So, but as a first defense from a company, you might hear the legitimate interest. So currently, we do have a gray area in that aspect. So the answer might be in the evolution of the vision we have currently on the GDPR and on privacy. What I do believe, however, is that what we did so far is an evolution. So we can notice significantly that this is starting to become something important and something very relevant, something to be placed on the agenda. And this is something that actually was seen on the 25th of May when everybody had like so different interpretations about what the GDPR doesn't, and so on and so forth. However, after the 25th of May last year, things have pretty much gone in the direction of privacy. Now companies are thinking about it. Now, and us as a data subjects, what we should do, and as members of an open source community, is in fact be aware of the fact that we do have lots of rights and we do have the possibility of using them. So if we use these rights, we are actually putting pressure on the private sector, and we are putting pressure on, we are putting pressure on this evolution. We are contributing basically to them offering more attention towards this topic. So